Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking one of the most tumultuous, nail-biting eras in modern technology. We're looking at the years 2006 to 2016 for AMD. When you think of AMD today, you probably think of this absolute powerhouse, right? The company driving modern gaming consoles and high-end PCs. But after reaching a massive peak in 2006, the company entered a decade defined by what can only be described as a perfect storm. We're talking an era of self-inflicted wounds, incredibly risky bets, external market crises, and honestly, a near-total collapse. What started out as this really ambitious plan for massive expansion very quickly spiraled into a desperate day-to-day struggle just for sheer survival. So it really begs a massive question. How exactly does a tech giant go from peak industry dominance to a devastatingly low $2 stock price? Think of This Explainer as a corporate survival thriller that we're unpacking together. We're going to watch a massive company hit rock bottom, facing down the very real threat of bankruptcy, before discovering the absolute slimmest glimmer of hope. It's just a fascinating look at how quickly the mighty can fall in the tech world. Okay, let's dive into this timeline of what industry insiders often call AMD's lost decade. We're going to map out three major blows they sustained: the 2006 ATI acquisition and Intel's Conroe launch, the 2009 Global Foundry spinoff, and finally, the 2011 Bulldozer disaster. Section 1. The Gamble. Acquiring ATI Technologies. So, back in 2006, AMD was riding high. They were at the absolute height of their golden era. But instead of playing it safe, management decided to make this massive, decisive move to secure their future. They made a $5.4 billion gamble to acquire the graphics powerhouse ATI Technologies. It's kind of like, imagine buying a massive, sprawling mansion at the absolute peak of the real estate market, but it costs billions. That sheer crushing weight of debt literally cannot be overstated. It placed AMD under a mountain of financial pressure right at a moment when industry competition was seriously heating up. Now, what's really interesting about this is the brilliant long-term vision behind all that debt. It was a concept called the APU, or Accelerated Processing Unit. See, AMD wasn't just buying a company, they were buying a whole new concept. The grand ambition here was to merge traditional CPUs and graphics processors onto a single piece of silicon. This move positioned AMD as the only company on the planet capable of offering high-performance processors and graphics under one roof. It was an incredibly visionary idea. But, the timing just couldn't possibly have been worse. Which brings us to Section 2, the counterpunch, losing the performance crown. In the exact same year AMD took on billions in debt to buy ATI, their fiercest rival, Intel struck back with a vengeance. They launched their Core architecture, which was famously known by its codename, Conroe, and wow, it was a complete game-changer. It was faster, vastly more efficient, and undeniably superior to AMD's older, struggling chips. Almost overnight, AMD was stripped of the performance crown they had fought so tirelessly to earn. The balance of power in the tech world shifted instantly, leaving AMD entirely on the defensive, strapped for cash, and suddenly falling way behind in pure performance. All right, Section 3, the sacrifice. Becoming a fabless company. Let's jump to 2009. Squeezed by that crushing debt from the ATI acquisition and plummeting revenues because of Intel's Conroe, AMD needed a desperate financial survival tactic. So, they spun off their entire manufacturing division into a brand new, separate entity called Global Foundries, effectively becoming a fabless semiconductor company. Now, while this saved them massively because it drastically reduced operational costs, the painful trade-off was giving up direct control over making their own physical chips. In a highly competitive industry where manufacturing precision is quite literally everything, relying entirely on external third-party foundries was a huge, scary sacrifice of control. And that leads us to Section 4, the catastrophe, the Bulldozer era from 2011 to 2016. So, by 2011, AMD had survived the debt crisis, they'd survived the manufacturing spinoff, and they were finally ready to launch their grand comeback attempt. This was the highly anticipated Bulldozer architecture. But instead of a comeback, it became one of the biggest failures in modern CPU history. You gotta wonder, why did a design that actually sounded incredibly promising on paper fail so spectacularly in the real world? Well, Bulldozer was built on a controversial philosophy that prioritized cramming higher core counts into the chip rather than focusing on strong individual core performance. And this brilliantly illustrates the devastating real-world fatal flaws of that philosophy. First, it suffered from incredibly weak single-core performance. For a consumer, this severely bottlenecks everyday tasks. If you were a gamer trying to run the latest titles, the chip just didn't hold up. Second, it required extremely high power consumption. Third, the overall efficiency was remarkably poor compared to what Intel was offering. And honestly, the craziest part, in many cases, these brand new Bulldozer CPUs actually performed worse than AMD's own previous generation processors. It just pushed them even further behind Intel. The absolute climax of this descent, it brought AMD's stock price crashing down to roughly $2 per share. Think about that, less than the cost of a bad cup of coffee. They lost billions in market value and faced major, incredibly painful layoffs. At this absolute low point, the wider financial and tech communities actively viewed AMD as a very real bankruptcy risk. The perfect storm had nearly drowned them entirely. But as we move into our final section, seeds of a comeback, surviving the perfect storm. So the crucial point is, we kind of have to shift our tone here, because discovering how they survived this perfect storm is truly fascinating. The relentless overlapping crises we've explored, a decade of crushing debt from ATI, lost performance to Intel, the structural overhaul, and the disastrous Bulldozer architecture, it all fundamentally broke the old AMD. But in doing so, it actually reshaped the company into something entirely new. Because even in their darkest era, seeds for a massive comeback were quietly being planted. They now fully owned the Radeon graphics division, an invaluable asset that would become the backbone for modern gaming consoles and data centers. Their leaner, cost-effective fabless business model freed them up to focus entirely on chip design rather than sinking billions into factory upkeep. And they walked away with deep, hard-earned engineering lessons from the Bulldozer failure. The profound irony here is that the very things that nearly killed them, the HEI acquisition, giving up their fabs, became the exact tools they would need to survive the next decade. Which leaves us with a provocative thought. Could the incredibly painful, near-fatal lessons of the Bulldozer disaster and the lost decade actually be the spark for the greatest comeback in tech history? When you consider the sheer scale of the crisis they survived between 2006 and 2016, it is nothing short of miraculous that they lived to fight another day. It perfectly sets the stage for a dramatic rise from the ashes, leaving you eager to see exactly how they eventually pull it off. Thank you for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning how the biggest failures often pave the way for the greatest successes.